The Eagles are one of the biggest selling rock bands in history, having sold more than 100 million records in the United States alone and over 200 million worldwide. They started out as a four-piece country rock-style vocal group of long-haired kids from California and changed their style over to a more edgier rock sound a few years later. A big part of that changeover, which occurred starting in 1974, was the hiring of a guitarist from Florida who had recently relocated to California. His name was Don Felder. It was a long and wild ride, to say the least. Here is Don's story. Donald William Felder was born September 21st, 1947, in Gainesville, Florida. He lived with his father and mother and his older brother Jerry in a small home that his father built himself. Don admits they were very poor. At 5 years old, Don complained of headaches and feeling tired all the time. After a doctor's visit, he was diagnosed with early symptoms of polio. They quickly gave him the newly developed Salk vaccine, and he spent 4 months in a polio ward, which must have been a terrifying experience for him. But thanks to a little luck and getting the vaccine, Don's symptoms never fully developed. Don started playing guitar when he was 10 after trading a neighborhood kid some cherry bombs for a beat-up old acoustic. The guitar wasn't very good at all, but he went to the drugstore in town and bought some new strings to put on it and played it till his fingers would bleed. When he was 16, Don said, "I was on fire for music, for rock and roll. I was in a band with Stephen Stills. I didn't have a driver's license, so my mother would drive us around to little shows, little fraternity parties, things like that. I loved the enthusiasm and energy of playing live for people." Around this time, he met Dwayne and Greg Allman, who had a band and was playing a lot around the Daytona Beach, Florida area. It was Dwayne who sat with Don at his house and helped him learn to play slide guitar. His best lesson of all came in some advice. He told Don, "Close your eyes and listen to the music, man. Feel it in your heart, and when your spine tingles, you'll know it's right." Don became a really good slide guitarist. I wouldn't put him up there with Dwayne, but then again, I'd have to think about it pretty hard to put anyone up there with Dwayne Allman. In 1963, Don met Bernie Leadon. Bernie's family had moved from the West Coast to Florida. Don and Bernie became close friends. Their music tastes varied, as Bernie was into bluegrass and country, and Don rock and blues, but they seemed to have a tight bond. And it would be Bernie who, after he left Florida and went back to California, would keep on Don to move west where he said the music was happening. And when Don finally did decide to go, it was Bernie who opened his home up to Don, his wife, and dog, and helped him get settled and find some work on the West Coast. Don took a job at a local music store in Gainesville. This was the music store he would also teach guitar lessons at, one of his students being Tom Petty. But around home, things weren't going so good. Don was letting his hair grow, smoking pot, and playing guitar. His older brother Jerry had finished law school, got a job at a small firm in Gainesville, and was moving out. His father, not too happy with the road Don was heading down, and with Jerry not around, it didn't end well. It ended up with Don and his father in a fight, and Don left home. He was never to return. With his best friend Bernie Leadon gone to the West Coast, and his girlfriend Susan moving back to Boston, which eventually caused them to break up, at least for the time being, Don was pretty much alone. He was still playing in the band the Monde Quintet that him and Bernie had played in when he started getting interested in jazz music. He was asked to join a band from Ocala, Florida called Flow. They were described by Don as a free-form jazz rock band heavily influenced by pot. Flo worked on original material, and in the fall of 1968, they loaded up a beat-up van and headed to New York to play a showcase for some record labels. To their surprise, they were offered a record deal with a $5,000 advance. They quickly talked it over and accepted. Don says the $5,000 lasted about a month as they put a down payment on a bigger and better van, a warm coat each, and a few new mics for their PA system. The rest of the money went on pot, food, rolled cigarettes, and Jack Daniels. But they were in New York with a record deal. The band worked as much as they could, but it was pretty clear to Don after a year or so this wasn't going to work. They did make it to Woodstock in 1969, but just to hang out and watch. It was around this time Don decided to call his old girlfriend Susan, who had moved to Boston. After tracking her down, they started back seeing each other again, and it was then Don decided to leave the band Flo. After a few hard words and an argument over the van the band owned, Don split to Boston and Susan. Probably a really good move on Don's part. After moving in with Susan in a small apartment, Don took whatever gigs he could find, playing his nylon string guitar at the Holiday Inn for a dinner crowd, to working at a small studio just hiring session musicians from the college. He made $50 a week for that. Don married Susan in April of 1971. He invited his parents up to Boston and would see them for the first time since he left home years earlier. His brother would come also and be his best man. After the wedding, him and his father shook hands, so it seems the ice was broken just a little between Don and his family. Don and Bernie kept in touch, and by this time, Bernie had left the Flying Burrito Brothers, worked for Linda Ronstadt, and had stayed in the band after they left Linda and started a nice career with the Eagles. In 1972, Bernie came to Boston as the newly formed band, the Eagles, were opening for Yes. They were doing a one-nighter at the Boston University. Bernie called Don and invited him and Susan to the show and to hang out. It was at this show Don was to meet Glenn Frey, Don Henley, and Randy Meisner for the first time. Bernie introduced him to Glenn Frey as the lightest fingers I know on a Stratocaster. Glenn said, "Hey, Fingers," and I guess this is where the nickname stuck, as he was always known around the Eagles as Don Fingers Felder. Bernie and Don jammed some on a few guitars they had laying around there in the dressing room before the show. Everyone was getting into it. In parting after the show that night, Bernie told Susan, "You should let Don go to L.A., just to prove he can do it. You'd never look back, either of you." I guess you could say that the seed Bernie planted started to grow that night, because 2 months later, Don and Susan sold what they could of their belongings, loaded up the rest of it in their 1965 Volvo with 120,000 miles on it, rented a trailer, put their dog Kilo in the back seat, and headed to Los Angeles. This was the summer of 1972. The song Take It Easy had just been released by the Eagles that May and was to climb up the Billboard charts and peak at number 12 in late July. About the same time, Don and Susan were heading west to a new life. After arriving in California, they stayed with Bernie Ledden until they got a place of their own. Don and Susan both took day jobs, and Don started looking around for gigs playing guitar. It took him almost a year to land a decent one. Bernie had introduced Don to Irving Azoff, the Eagles manager. Irving set Don up for an audition with a fellow named David Blue, who had cut an album and was needing an instrumentalist to play his music as a duo. Don quickly learned the mandolin and lap steel and headed over to where David Blue was living in an apartment. They sat down and worked on the songs, and Blue hired Don that day. They played their first gig in September of 1973. The tour went well, and they were opening for Graham Nash and David Crosby. And one night, their guitar player took sick, and Don filled in. The show went real well, and Graham Nash came to Don later and said it went so well that they weren't having their guitars back. Now Don was opening with David Blue, and then after the intermission, he came out and played with Crosby and Nash. Stephen Stills came on the tour later on to play some. Now Don and Stephen had played together years back in Florida. So as Don put it, things were going real well and a lot of fun. And for a while, it was Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Felder. The tour ended that winter, and one was set up for the following spring of 1974 with the same lineup. Don was thrilled and accepted. Susan by this time was pregnant with their first child, and they moved into a bigger apartment. But a phone call in January would change Don's life in a big way. The call was from Glenn Frey, and he asked Don if he would like to come over to the studio and lay down a track on a song they were doing. Glenn said they needed a real dirty slide sound and thought it would be a perfect fit for Don. Don said yes, that he could really use the extra session work, wrote down the address of the studio, and told Glenn he'd see him the next day. The next day, Don laid down the guitar for a song called Good Day in Hell. They got it in about 6 takes, so Glenn asked him to do another, which was the song Already Gone. After finishing up, they kicked back, had a few beers, and listened to the playback. Don then packed up and went home. The next morning at breakfast, the phone rang at Don's house. It was Glenn Frey, and Don officially became a member of the Eagles that morning. It wasn't long after the album On the Border that the Eagles had its first meeting and became the Eagles Limited, to where all 5 members were to share in the profits equally. Everything was split 5 ways. Contracts were signed, and they got down to business. The next album, One of These Nights, pushed the group to the front of the line. But with the change in music and direction, Don's friend Bernie Leadon was not happy. He would eventually leave the group and move to Hawaii. It was announced on December 20th, 1975, that Bernie was leaving the group and that the group was hiring their manager, Irving Azoff's client, Joe Walsh, to take his place. I'm sure many people in the rock and roll world was like myself and thought, Joe Walsh and the Eagles? I mean, to me, back then, Joe was just a guitar god with a Les Paul and his Marshall cranked up to 11. How could he ever tone it down to fit the Eagles? But he toned down a little, and the Eagles toned up, and they met in the middle, and the album that was to come next was monumental. With Don and Joe on guitars, they became a force to be reckoned with. Don and Joe seemed to bring out the best in each other, and the Eagles soared. But if you want to hear Joe's story, I did a video on him a while back. I'll put a link up here to it and one in the description below, so you can all check it out. Joe's story is one I'm sure you will enjoy. So a little over a year after Joe Walsh replaced Bernie Leadon, the album Hotel California was released. What a great album it was. The guitar work on that album was just fantastic. Don Felder wrote the basic layout of the music for the title track, Hotel California. And him and Joe worked out the solos together. Don Henley wrote a majority of the words with a little help from Glenn Frey. The whole song was just captivating, as was the whole album, really. But as the touring started, so did the stress. Now, as Don said in his book, the band fought all the time, which earlier led to an almost physical confrontation between Glenn Frey and Bernie Leadon when he left. Well, this time again, it was Glenn and the bass player Randy Meisner, and things got even a little more physical after Glenn called Randy a pussy. Either way, Randy decided to quit the group. I guess it must have really been bad for him to walk away from all that hard work and money, but Randy just up and left. Him and Bernie both gave up their shares of the Eagles and walked away, leaving just 3 members owning the shares in the group. Timothy Schmidt was hired to replace him, and the Eagles moved on. But it wasn't to last long, as now Don Henley and Glenn were starting to really get into it. And finally, after another great album, The Long Run, they called it quits after Don Felder, and again it was Glenn Frey, in the middle of a confrontation that almost came to blows after a show. Don admits that cocaine had a lot to do with it, and I'm sure it did. The stress of the constant touring, and then going back into the studio and trying to come up with something better, or at least as good as Hotel California. Either way, the Eagles were done, and all 5 members went their separate ways, at least for the time being, and things would really never be the same again. Don came home, and things basically went from bad to worse for him. His wife, who I'm sure had her suspicions, had went through some fan mail and confronted Don about the parties and women on the road. Don tried to step back into a father role and head of the house that he had been away from for so long, and left his wife to handle it all. The outcome wasn't going to be good no matter what. So Don was out of a job, his marriage heading downhill. He was trying to make up for lost time with his kids. Not a good situation to be in. I guess the only thing that did work was that he did have money, and he decided to build a new home. He turned down any offers to go on the road. Don Henley even called him to go on tour with him to push his solo album, and Don turned him down. He did do a lot of session work around town with the likes of Stevie Nicks, Bob Seger, Warren Zevon, Boz Scaggs, and the Bee Gees. He also helped Joe Walsh out with his solo album. With all the other Eagles doing solo albums, Don decided to give it a shot. The album was called Airborne and had 8 songs on it. He got some good players to help him out, including Dave Mason, Kenny Loggins, and Timothy B. Schmidt to help him out on the harmony vocals. But even with all the help, the album was just okay in my opinion, and it got some bad reviews too. I think one of the biggest issues with it was Don produced it, and I'm sure he was involved in the final mixdown, and his vocals are just buried. Still a decent album, and worth giving it a listen. I just wish you could hear the lead vocals a bit better. Even with headphones on, it's still tough. The album cover, which had a Fender guitar coming down on a parachute, and Don's last names takes on the Fender lettering, is pretty catchy. Through the years, there were a few attempts to get the Eagles back together, but a snag always seemed to come up. And then, some of Nashville's country artists did covers of the Eagles hits, calling the album Common Threads, and it was a big seller, a big success. Travis Tritt, I guess, can take some of the credit for finally getting the Eagles back together, as he recorded the song Take It Easy for the Common Threads album and decided he wanted all the Eagles in the video. Some way, somehow, magic was worked, and they all came together for the video, and that got the ball rolling. And after a lot of talk, the contracts were signed, and the Eagles were back together. In 1994, the Hell Freezes Over tour started. The album, a mixture of some studio and live cuts, was released after the video, which came first, and now has sold over 9 million copies. The tour, which ran from 1994 to 1996, was one of the most successful in history. The Eagles were back on top again. But as always, with that band, things behind the scene wasn't so good. Don, being a third shareholder in the Eagles Limited, wasn't too happy with the way the money was being spent. Don and Glenn, coming off some great solo careers, were stars, and acting like it. Either way, Don didn't like it, and I guess he was right. But to get him off their backs, since he just didn't walk away, leave his shares on the table and quit like Bernie and Randy did, Don Henley and Glenn Frey fired Don Felder in early 2001. Don ended up suing, and although the details of the settlement cannot be disclosed, Don came out on the good end. At least money-wise, I guess he did, but he has not been back with the band since. He was hurt his good friend Joe Walsh didn't stick up for him more when he was fired, but he said he wasn't mad, and he totally understood where Joe and Timothy were both coming from. They had to think of their jobs too. Don owned in that company. Tim and Joe were just sidemen, as they still are today. Don went into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1998 along with other members and former members of the Eagles. I do think they were the best and peaked during the Hotel California days. But you cannot deny whether it was early Eagles or later Eagles, the music was great. Don Felder, after being fired, wrote his book Heaven and Hell, My Life in the Eagles. Although Henley and Fry filed a countersuit against Don Felder and held up the book's publication, it was finally released in the United States in 2008. The book is very good, well written, and worth the read. Don Felder, at 75 years old, still looks good today and is out touring with his group playing all the old Eagles hits. He says he don't do it for the money, he just does it because he enjoys playing. The band he had last time I saw them were top-notch, and so was Don's guitar playing. His tone was still sweet and his fingers smooth. If you get a chance to go and see the show, it's basically a tribute band to the Eagles with Don singing all the songs, but you will still hear some of them great guitar licks that made the Eagles soar from 1974 to 2001. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit the like button, subscribe, ring the bell to get notified. Catch y'all later. Thanks again.